We're especially delighted to be hosting Wesley Lowery this evening. He's written a very timely and very significant book. As a reporter for the Washington Post, Wesley has spent a good deal of time covering the communities in this country hardest hit by the use of excessive and at times deadly police force against blacks. Places like Ferguson, Cleveland, Charleston, and Baltimore. He's examined the effect of racially biased policing, explored other aspects of ongoing discrimination in neighborhoods where the levels of frustration and anger run high, and he's gotten to know a new generation of black activists and reporters. His experiences, findings, and thoughts are recounted in his new book, They Can't Kill Us All. Wesley got into reporting. I mean, he first started in middle school, actually. And by the time he got to college at Ohio University, he ended up serving as editor-in-chief of the campus paper. He did a stint as a reporting fellow at the Los Angeles Times, then moved to the Boston Globe for a short time before arriving at the Post in 2014. While covering the Ferguson protests for the Post 2 years ago, he became part of the story for a bit when police arrested him and another reporter in a McDonald's. Police said the two journalists hadn't moved fast enough when the order was given to clear the restaurant. Earlier this year, Wesley was part of a Washington Post team that won the Pulitzer for national reporting for a project dubbed Fatal Force that tracked nearly 1,000 police shootings last year. Wesley's book has gotten a number of very favorable reviews. The Star Tribune in Minneapolis called it, quote, insightful and unnerving. And the New York Times said the book, quote, is electric because it is so well reported, so plainly told, and so evidently the work of a man who has not grown a callus on his heart. Wesley will be in conversation here this evening with Kevin Merida, himself a veteran journalist. For the past year, Kevin has been at ESPN, where he served as a senior vice president and editor-in-chief of the Undefeated, a digital platform that explores the intersections of race, sports, and culture. Previously, Kevin worked 22 years at the Washington Post, the last 3 as managing editor for news and features coverage. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Wesley Lowery and Kevin Merida.
Good evening to all of you. Thanks for coming. Wes and I just both got back from New York.
I did, moments ago.
Moments ago, so we're glad to be here.
Of course, I see a lot of friendly faces and some I don't know. I'm sorry to break it to anyone who's here for the Bernie Sanders Politics and Prose. That's tomorrow night.
I want to be there for that, too.
But,
so we got first of all, let me just say congratulations.
Thank you.
And I loved your book. You know, it has warmth and grace and a lot of humanity in it. You know, I think we've all been watching, you know, the protests. Most of us haven't had the opportunity to be on the ground, but watching from afar. And I think you really kind of, you know, let us know who these people are who are protesting, and you make them real. I think the book has a lot of realness and rawness. You know, as a journalist who covered all these protests, I'm wondering what made you decide to write a book about it?
You know, I think that what was fascinating about watching what began as these what felt like isolated incidents. I remember when I first got sent to Ferguson, I got on a Monday morning, and I thought I was going to go do a news of the day story for Tuesday, maybe collect some string and write some weekender, and I thought I would be home that weekend. I had plans that weekend, right? And so I was planning on, I don't need to cancel my Saturday night plans. I'll file this thing Friday, fly back Saturday morning. What became clear very quickly was that these were not one-off stories, right? What was fascinating, and I talked to colleagues and friends who were on the ground in places like Ferguson and Baltimore, and what was unique, unlike a lot of other stories I covered, was it was so clear from the very beginning that this was more than the story in front of us. It was deeper. We weren't all just here to tell this, to file for tomorrow. We could feel something, gripping at the fabric of democracy and of humanity in these places. But even as I covered these stories and continued to cover these stories and learned as I did them, as Ferguson became New York, became Cleveland, became Charleston and Baltimore and so on, I would still, what was fascinating about the dynamic here is that each shooting or each incident that goes viral, that makes headlines, for a lot of people is their entryway into it. They blew off Ferguson. I mean, Michael Brown didn't have his hands up, so I don't have to care about that. Or Eric Garner shouldn't have been selling those cigarettes, so I don't care about that one. Or, Tamir Rice's toy gun kind of looked like a real gun. But it's fascinating how with each shooting, each incident, I get emails from new people who say, well, all those other ones deserved it, but this one seems... And with that, I'd also get emails and I'd get calls from readers to this day who just could not comprehend it. They couldn't get it. What do these people want? Why are they in the street? What are they asking for? And I thought that, after having written, probably over 100 stories for us at the Post on this, I thought there was a real need to turn these people, these young activists, into something bigger, something more than just the caricatures, the one-line sentences, the quotes that we were getting in the paper, and rather to make them something bigger and broader. And because I really believe that if you can understand any one of these individuals as a human, you can see their three dimensions, you can understand why 1,000 other people are there with them.
Your portraits of them, like, Netta LZ, some of the ones I remember, Bree Newsome training, to climb a flagpole to take down the flag in South Carolina, DeRay McKesson. Did you come away with impressions of them that would be instructive to people that do not know them, that would inform us about the movements that we're seeing taking place?
Of course. I mean, I think that these are, at their core, these are just real people, right? And I think that so many of them have been informed by their lives, and that their previous experiences are what have driven them into the streets. And so Ginetta LZ is one of the first people who I profile, who you all know her as Netta on Twitter, is one of the most outspoken Ferguson protesters, and was the first person I met in Ferguson. I had DM'd her on Twitter because she was the person on the ground, and I said, hey, can we meet up? And she immediately live tweeted our DM conversation. This reporter from the Washington Post wants to come and tell the real story. Oh my gosh, guys! And so I still tease her about that. But to understand, and so Ginetta became one of these faces of Ferguson. She became one of these people. And what was fascinating about Ginetta was she was so critical of the media coverage. She would blast every headline. What do you mean a mob forms outside of Ferguson? What do you mean this? And one of the reasons was one of her best friends had been killed by the police earlier that year. Stephon Avery Hart was one of the last police shootings in greater St. Louis prior to the Michael Brown shooting. And she had watched how this man, this person who'd been so close to her, who she knew as one of the sweetest people, one of her protectors, someone who looked out for her, became villainized in the local media. And some of it was accurate, some of it was inaccurate, right? They had misidentified him initially, so they're describing him as a felon, even though he had a clean record. And she watched how this person became less than a person, and then she made the mistake that she read all the comments on this too. So all these people, well, that thug deserved it, and she's reading this about her friend. And so as she's sitting there, watching in her community, people come outside, get upset, there's a body in the street, she made this vow that not today, not another person, that I didn't know better when this happened to Stephon, but I'm not gonna let this happen to someone else, that Mike Brown's not gonna be remembered that way. They're not gonna warp him and warp his memory. And so, and that is, one of the reasons, like I said, that I told these stories the way I did was because I think those protests were full of hundreds of Ginettas. Hundreds of people who came out for that type of reason, that this was personal to them. This was about the time they had gotten pulled over. This was about the time their cousin had gotten, punched by an officer or roughed up by a squad of officers. And I think the other thing is that there's an assumption very often because of the politics of many of the demonstrators that they're apolitical. And that's not true. You know, many of these young activists who are some of the driving forces of these demonstrations are deeply political, are people who showed up for the first time to vote for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. I can remember sitting talking to some of them as they talked, remembering watching the rallies of Obama, fired up, ready to go, having these conversations. Bree Newsom canvassed for Barack Obama, right? And so what I think is instructive is to try to think about, especially now at a time where we're seeing massive protests and demonstrations around the country following an election, what drives someone into the street? Because street protest is a form of democratic participation. It's something that people do when they feel as if their other avenues of participation have not served them. So why, if you are a center-left college student in Portland, are you in the streets right now? Well, because your vote for Hillary Clinton didn't change anything, did it, right? And that's I'll never forget, there was this this town hall hosted by Gwen Ifill in Ferguson not long after the shooting. And at one point, there's a local activist and rapper, Tef Poe, and they set up this dialogue between him and Senator Claire McCaskill. And she's falling into what becomes kind of the trope we often hear from the powers that be when there's massive unrest. Well, we need to register everyone to vote, and you guys all need to call your city council members. And Tef Poe looks at her and says, I voted for Barack Obama twice, and Michael Brown's still dead. And I think that in many ways captures the political ethos of the young people who've made up this movement.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Barack Obama. I got a document here, otherwise known
From Barack Obama? Did you read the book?
Yeah. Otherwise known as a printout of a New York Times review. And you made an observation I kind of wanted to ask you about. I'm just going to read, this is a passage from the book that they highlighted. It said, the headlines of the Obama years often seemed a yearbook of Black death, raising a morbid and depressing quandary for Black men and women. Why had the promise and potential of such a transformative presidency not yet reached down to the lives of those who elected him? Even the historic Obama presidency could not suspend the injunction that playing by the rules wasn't enough to keep you safe. What protection was offered by a Black presidency when, as James Baldwin once wrote, the world is white and we are Black? How do you answer your own questions you pose?
There is no protection. And I think I've been using this line a lot. My friend and the author, Jelani Cobb, said this to me a few months ago, but this idea that we needed a Black presidency to show us the limitations of a Black presidency, that in part because of his platform and how he ran, the idea that this was a president who was running on a broadly inclusive platform, his rhetorical skills and abilities played into this as well. You think about in his DNC speech talking about how we don't have a white America and a Black America and a Hispanic America. On the night he accepts the presidency, he talks about how we're not a collection of red states and blue states, but rather a United States, right? The fundamental ideology of the President of the United States was one that puts forth the idea that America is exceptional, America is great because we have the ability to keep getting better and that we will, right? What I think many people, people who both agreed with the president and disagreed with the president, they believed somehow that Barack Obama had promised to usher this in, which in many ways was a misreading of his speeches. When you go back, he's actually explicitly clear that, like, and this is on all of us, and I can't change everything, but we all just kind of heard the hope and change part of it, right? And so there was this belief, this misguided belief, that somehow, well, if only we could elect the Black guy to run the nation, then those last 300 years, they didn't really happen, and everything else is good, and it's all going to be fine. In reality, there's a massive limitation to what someone in the presidency can even do. And on top of that there's a debate happening right now about what is racism. And this is coming in the context of, are Donald Trump supporters racist? Or can we call them that? Can we not? And, But what I think that debate speaks to is a deeper issue and conversation that we have about what is racism and what does that look like and how does that manifest. Are racist and is racism scary people wearing hoods who say bad words, right? Mm-hmm. Or is it both that and systems that are designed intentionally or unintentionally to oppress or suppress groups of people, right? Because if it's the second thing, which I would argue it is, a singular person is never going to be able to undo that, right? Mm-hmm. Putting a person of color, a person with pigment in their skin, on top of a school system that wasn't designed to serve students of color isn't going to undo that. In the same way that placing a person with pigment in their skin atop a governmental system that was not designed to produce equitable results that one person is never going to be able to achieve that.
Yeah. My wife says we're all racist.
We are.
I see her out there, so I shouted her out. So under Ferguson happened, and then more happened, and more kept happening. And it became kind of framed under this movement, Black Lives Matter, to the point now where that's even a controversial thing. People are either running away from that. Some African Americans are running away from that because it's become so politicized without even being able to grasp it. It's as you write in your book, there are lots of affiliated groups. You mentioned multiple groups, but the big umbrella is Black Lives Matter. And how have you come to see, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you?
I think that, and it speaks to the power of the media. I mean, I remember the day when, what was fascinating was being on the ground, which is where I was for most of Ferguson, right? I was there for almost all of August 2014, a good chunk of September and October, and literally all of November 2014 while this was developing. And so what was interesting was in those rare occasions when we would break out of that, where I'd come home for a weekend or I'd be in the airport and I'd see cable news for the first time. I mean, there were memes, there were conversations, there were whole things happening in Ferguson that I didn't see any of because whatever funny thing happened with Jake Tapper or Don Lemon, I was on the street, I wasn't watching it, right? And so there was this moment in time that I remember where at the beginning, the chants in Ferguson were very specific. There were hands up, don't shoot. There were no justice, no peace. The whole damn system's guilty as hell, right? And there was this infusion, eventually, of some of the Black Lives Matter language and ideology. And then, a month or two into it, there was this rush of pieces that were like, well, let's introduce you to the real people who started this. Let's talk about the real movement. It pitted the organic demonstrators of St. Louis against some of the activists and groups that had been doing this work in other places, right, who'd been doing kind of movement building. I mean, Black Lives Matter, the declaration, the hashtag was something that was started after the George Zimmerman acquittal, so in 2013. But it was something that largely existed on the internet as a rallying cry, right? And it was in Ferguson that people took to the streets and then seized that rallying cry and started projecting it, right? And so very quickly, many of us in the media seized on that as a quick turn of phrase, as something we could call it. If this was going to be a movement, it was going to be the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, what was fascinating about that is actually largely wreaked havoc within the activist space, because we have in that declaration taken what has been the name of a specific organization, a network of organizations, and we've applied it broadly to every black person who might be in the street and upset about police, no matter what city they're in, right? And that serves often to erase the work of grassroots people who are already there. So the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis, for example, or Baltimore Block in Baltimore, they've been in there for decades doing this work and having rallies and caring about this, and it can feel like they got erased. And in the same sense, you have, because of the politics internally, you have people who very strongly say, I'm not associated with this group, who become Black Lives Matter leader, Black Lives Matter protest, And so I think what's been fascinating being on the inside of this is seeing the power of the media to, one of the biggest complaints we hear, all of us hear constantly, right, is that the media we get everything wrong, we're hopelessly biased, we don't understand it, and I vocally push back on that a lot. I think that what we know is that most people in the media work very hard to get things right and to be fair. But I do think that there is sometimes a built-in misunderstanding, and we allow what we don't understand to shape our coverage rather than sometimes listening a little harder and figuring it out. Because when we paint pictures without nuances and without those details, there are lingering effects to that.
Well, you have great nuances and details in your book. The other thing you have in your book is kind of your own personal journey through the story and the toll it takes on you. I think you show a lot of vulnerability yourself of covering kind of a stream of Black death, I think you called it at one point. And at one point you describe kind of, after being in Ferguson, I guess you were like 3 months, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, you guys
and then
didn't let me come home. It was
I know. You're blaming it on me
it's his
now.
fault.
Yeah, I was managing editor at the time. But we actually needed him there. But Walter Scott happened, being killed in South Carolina and not wanting to go, and you mentioned like crying about that and just feeling like you couldn't do that anymore. And so just describe, because they're basically unarmed black men, people that look like you and our parents and others, and just how did you wrestle that down?
I think that there's more recently, even after the book was written, during this last spat of shootings, during the Alton Sterling and Philando Castillo shooting, I remember we in the Post did something that someone didn't like on the internet, and people were tweeting me about it. And I remember these two women were coming at me, and then they were saying, because they had criticized something, and I responded to them, said, hey, well, we can fix this thing, but I actually don't think I think you're reading this too cynically. And they said, well, you don't know what this is like. You just have to cover this. We have to live this, right? And I kind of sharply responded, yeah, you're right. Like, I would have no idea what it's like to be traumatized by watching black people get killed. Like, I just have to talk to the families. I don't have to, think about it, right? And so this idea that there are layers to how we take these things in, and over time, we have to make decisions as reporters. I talk to other reporters who cover this, and other people who are in this space constantly, about how do you decide how much to expose yourself to and how much to deal with this and how much to consume. I mean, back in Ferguson and then Cleveland, New York, and then when we get to Walter Scott in North Charleston, I had no process whatsoever to how to deal with this. I was watching every video, I was reading every tweet sent at me, I was reading every email, listening to every voicemail, responding to most of them. I had no comprehension of the potential damage and harm, and also just the resource in terms of my time and energy that was being spent dealing with all types of nonsense, right? Because the messengers become the thing people can attack. When Walter Scott was killed, I'd gotten a heads up that this video was going to come out. Walter Scott was killed on a Friday, I believe.
And give people the details if they don't know.
Of course, yes. So Walter Scott was a 50-year-old man in North Charleston, South Carolina. He got pulled over by Officer Michael Slager because he had a missing third taillight. Which is not actually a crime that you can stop someone for in South Carolina. But he's pulled over. Walter Scott had some outstanding child support, and he had previously been incarcerated for outstanding child support, so he knew this was something they could take him to jail for. And so as he's pulled over, he's waiting for the officer to run his paperwork, Walter Scott gets out of the car and runs away. At the time, like I said, I believe he's killed on a Thursday or a Friday, maybe it was a Saturday morning. The officer says, his officer's story is, he gets out of the car and he runs. We get into a physical confrontation, and Walter Scott gets my taser, is standing over me and is about to hit me with the taser, and so I pulled my gun and shot and killed him. Open and shut case, right? This is the kind of case that we don't spend much time writing about. Armed guy attacked a police officer, had his taser. That's a bad guy. He deserved it. I mean, whatever. He deserved it, right? And the initial round of coverage reflected that. The attorney for the officer is quoted in the Post and Courier, which is a great paper, is quoted essentially saying, Michael Slager is the kind of officer we want out in the streets, something along those lines. So then I get a call, unbeknownst to the officers, unbeknownst to the city government, that there was a man standing and watching, that he had pulled his cell phone out, and he followed this interaction. And so he sends that tape, and it's interesting when you listen to his interviews, he talks about how he wanted to wait and see how the police handled it. He wanted to see what the police story was. He'd seen this whole thing, but he wanted to see what happened. And when the police said this guy had it coming, he deserved it, he said, all right, I'm putting this video out. And so he sends this video to the family, who then gives it to the police. And I get a call from a source of mine who, who works, it's this very kind of morbid fraternity of people, of regulars who we all talk very often, right? And there's a public relations official who works with many of these attorneys. It's his job to write the statement for the family or to reach out to the media when the attorney's busy doing attorney stuff, right? And so he gives me this call and he goes, I can't give you the details yet, and I can't give you the video. We already placed it, right? It becomes a media thing, right? The New York Times could get a few more eyeballs on it than I could, and so, but you need to find out everything you can find out about Walter Scott. This guy was killed 3 days ago. No one's written about it. Go find everything out, because in 3 hours the video is going to be bigger than Eric Gardner. And that was such a strange moment, right? Because for so many of these instances, it seems like they come out of nowhere. For most of us, we experience them like all of a sudden some name is trending on the internet. Everyone's talking about some video, and it's like, I got to figure this out right now. And it was this odd moment of having like a 3-hour heads up, where now I'm looking at the Facebook page of the guy who's about to be the hashtag because his name hasn't gone viral yet, right? Nothing's been pulled down. I can actually Google him and find things because it's not full of news articles yet. And so I remember as we prepared for this story, myself and my colleague, Mark Berman, who I do a lot of my work with, we started working on this story, and because we were watching for it, we saw that the city of North Charleston had called a press conference. And we're like, why'd they call a press conference? And as soon as they saw the video, they weren't waiting for the media embargo on the video. They fired the officer and charged him with a crime. And so we were on this story while those who had the video had to wait until their 7 o'clock or whenever it was. And I remember we got through the first day. We contextualized that story. We'd done a bunch of reporting. And I remember my editors calling me in the office and saying, all right, we want you on the next plane out. We want you on the plane in the morning. And I'm kind of hemming and hawing. Well, I mean, do we really need to go? I mean, we know what happened. And I'm doing that thing where you kind of talk in circles. Well, if you really need me to go, I'll go. But I think we could cover this. And they're like, no, you got to go. You got to get on the plane. And, you know, at that point, I just really wanted to take a shooting off, right? You know, I had gotten to this point where it had started to feel like such a familiar process. All right, now I'm going to call the family. Now I'm going to show up outside of City Hall and talk to 4 protesters and ask them the 5 questions. Let me send some tweets because they'll get retweeted. Everyone will talk about this. And it started to feel in this way that was weighing on me. I didn't want to go to Walter Scott's house and talk to his mother. I didn't want to talk, you know, and I think that you know, I ended up breaking off and having a conversation with you know, some friends and mentors of mine who essentially said, well, you know you're going to go because you have to, right? This is your job. This is what you do. And I did. And it ended up being probably one of the better trips in that it helped me. You know, I ended up spending some time with Walter Scott's family. And that was one of the first families of these that I really had a lot of kind of unfettered access to. And really helped shape my ideology in terms of how I try to tackle these stories.
You've become this person that does this, right? I mean, when we hired you, you want to be a political writer.
Yeah, I wanted to cover what I thought was going to be the most substantive political campaign in American history in 2016.
And now we've had this election. And you know, your book lands at a time when we've had an election. We see, as you alluded to, the protests going on the streets. We have a lot of there's still police shootings. There's still this tension in the community. I mean, where do you actually think this is headed?
You know, I think that what's fascinating is I think we very often, in the media and kind of in the elites, those of us here in D.C. and New York, kind of have a dismissive posture towards protest, towards people in the streets, whether that's a Tea Party rally or Black Lives Matter shutting down a highway, right? That we very instinctively, and we see this in the media coverage all the time, we instinctively go to, well, what do these people want? What do the Trump protesters want, right? And and did you even vote? Who are you people? What are you doing? What? He's the president, get over it, right? And I think that is an easy posture to take until you've spent time in these spaces. Because what protest creates is it creates community and it creates space. And it creates power. That if I am, right, to take today's example, if I am a 21-year-old liberal college student who lives in Portland, I have very little power. I probably voted for Hillary Clinton if I voted. I could have canvassed for her, right? I live in a deep blue state with a minuscule number of electoral votes that in the arc of this election did not matter, had no power. And I woke up on Wednesday morning after the election with an incoming president who I did not vote for, who I did not want, right? So where do I seize my power? How do I make the government pay attention to me? I take my body and I put it in the streets, and someone else puts their body next to mine. And all of a sudden we have 50 people. And all of a sudden the arteries of the city are shut down. And now the mayor has to listen to us, and the governor has to listen to us, and in fact the president has to answer a question about us and what we're doing and what we want. And on top of that, you know, these protests, these demonstrations are community building. They build sentiment. They force conversations. We had, no matter whether you're inclined to agree with Black Lives Matter or disagree with Black Lives Matter, every person in the United States of America has had to think about these issues for the last 2 years. They've had to formulate an educated opinion on these things that otherwise they just might not have paid attention to. That then begins informing our electoral politics. So when you look at what we've seen over these last few years, you've seen insurgent candidacy in Bernie Sanders, and the basis of so much of his energy and so much of his platform, we all got a taste for with Occupy Wall Street and their rhetoric. You see these candidacies of people like Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, and you see how much of the basis of their candidacies were based in this Tea Party rhetoric. And so I think that what we've seen increasingly, at least very recently, has been this movement politics. People who operate outside of the establishment to force their preferred party, and both parties, if they're lucky, to move in one direction or the other. I don't think that's going to abate. I think that under a Trump presidency, we're very likely to see only increased activism, certainly on the left, as you have groups who have been used to going into the streets, whether that be Black and Latino activists, whether it be LGBT activists, whether that be immigration activists. These are people who've been protesting for generations, who one of the tools of their political activism has been taking to streets. I'd be shocked if I think the inauguration is going to be quite an event, right? I would be shocked if we don't see these types of clashing points, because this is with Republicans having full control of Washington, D.C., essentially, right? How might that disaffect, how might that dreamer, how might that LGBT youth who's scared that gay marriage is going to be overturned, how might that woman who's horrified that when Obamacare goes away, her health providers no longer have to give her birth control, how might they make their voice heard? Right. Voting is one way. Calling their representative is one way. But standing in the streets and saying this enough is another way.
Or in my neighborhood, the largest school, or at least one of them in Montgomery County, Montgomery Blair, students leaving school. That was their expression of their own disgust. And so everybody's trying to express their own pain, right? And let people know that in different ways. I mean, there's a really quiet moment. The thing of all of the words written in that book, the thing that I kept sitting on and couldn't get out of my head was your dad. And, I think you said every time you would come home, and be in the dining room, he would talk about this one killing in Cleveland, and he would say 137 bullets. He would just say 137 bullets. And the notion that, I can't remember the couple that got shot. It was certainly was on YouTube, Facebook, and everywhere else, of just the continued firing of two people, right? That turn about arm. And I think just the image of it, and also your dad, it's sitting with him that way.
Yeah, I thought that was, that's what's, police shootings and police violence at their core are death, right? They are significant events because someone has been killed, right? And because of that, people remember. In St. Louis, people remember the Jack in the Box shooting from a decade earlier when two men had been killed. In Cleveland, where I'm from, people remember. Well, the nation wasn't paying attention in early November 2012. Something else was going on, right? But in Cleveland, there was a massive car chase where two unarmed Black people had 137 bullets pumped into their vehicle, right? And that's not something, one officer jumped on the roof of the car and was reloaded 3 times and was firing into their bodies, right? That's not something that people forget. And I think that very often when we try to metabolize these shootings, we hyper-focus on the absolute specifics of the incident in front of us. And we forget that the people in the streets are angry not just about the incident in front of us, because they remember the last one, and they remember what did or did not happen. They remember the one before that. And that it's not necessarily about what lays in front of us. I actually think Ta-Nehisi Coates embodies this very well in his book, Between the World and Me, that he writes this piece of literature coming out of Ferguson, essentially, right? He writes it at this time about contemporary shootings. But what speaks to him is the death of his friend from Howard, right, who had been killed in a police shooting decades earlier, right? That these are not just headlines to the people who see this pain and experience this death. And so, like I said, I talk about going home, and my dad so frequently when we're having just kind of our oh, how's Cleveland doing? Well, Cleveland's still Cleveland. Like, as we're talking about this and talking about policing and talking about what's going on, I could just remember over and over and over again him referring to, yeah, but you remember that one shooting with 137 times? They would call it, people would always reference Bonnie and Clyde because Bonnie and Clyde were in a shootout. The police fired fewer times at Bonnie in the shootout that killed Bonnie and Clyde than the shootout that killed these two unarmed people in Cleveland.
Well, yeah, my wife, Donna Britt, who wrote about this, not only in her own book, Brothers and Me, but in an essay for the Post many years ago about the death of her own brother, at a time when we didn't have, cell phone cameras and captured it, and nobody knows what happened, but you have the sense that the police version is not what really happened, right? And now we're documenting it, right, in real time. That gets the attention of people around the nation in the same way that, finally some of what was happening in the civil rights movement got people's attention once they showed what was happening on Edmund Pettus Bridge on television. And you have become the social media star.
For better or worse.
Yeah, for better or worse, but that started at Ferguson. I certainly remember, I won't forget that day when you got arrested down there with Ryan Riley, and word was coming to the newsroom, and I remember being around the desk and her saying, "We think Wes has gotten arrested." We said, "What? Wes has gotten arrested?" And we're checking it out, and we're trying to make sure you're all right, and you get it, if you make sure that notify lawyers, and we're doing all this stuff, and assured that everything was right, and lawyers were taking it. Then, of course, my next thing is we got to get them to write about it. We got to get a first person, and but after that, in the way we measure some of these things, I don't remember how far your Twitter followers jump, but I know now you have like 470,000. I checked before I came in here, and that's a lot. And that also, I just kind of wondered, what has that done to you as a reporter, for good or worse?
I think that one thing about social media is that it allows us as reporters to show ourselves in a way that previously we had been adamantly against, right? That you'd spend your career as a reporter, and then maybe if you did it long enough and well enough, you get to be a columnist, and then your face got to go in the newspaper, right? Before that, before social media, the theory was that the readers didn't even know what we looked like, right? They knew our names, and we were just bylines that sat atop stories, right? And only the columnist was a person, was a human, right? That we were otherwise disaffected and disengaged narrators of what was happening. And that's not the world we live in anymore. We live in a world in which we gauge what we consume very much off of, do I trust the individual person, not even necessarily the news outlet itself or more broadly. What becomes interesting about social media is that, especially for those of us who have come up with it natively, right? I've never been a professional reporter in a world where social media was not a factor, right? Is that it allows us, I say this all the time, when you sit under a spotlight, people can see everything, right? They see when you pop off on somebody, they see when you mishandle something, they see when that word isn't quite fair, and then they also see you grow over time, right? And my theory on that is that transparency is actually a good thing, because people can watch you, and even if they're initially predisposed to distrusting you or saying, "Oh, you must be this thing," I can woo you over time, right? But I think that what's been so interesting, I think all the time, and I was just most recently in Charlotte, I believe, was the most recent fatal shooting I was at, and before that, Milwaukee. And I think all the time how I wish I had the perspective on using social media then, in Ferguson and Eric Gardner, than I do now. In part because I think sometimes there's an inclination among us reporters to use every tool, every time, constantly. Right? Because this is what we're supposed to do, and the social media guy from the paper says they want me to do this, and I know I'm supposed to be. But I think that, much like writing, social media is a method of telling a story, right? Not every story is best told on it. Some stories are expertly told on it, right? Not every story merits a 9,000-word narrative piece, right? But the ones that do, you can't imagine a different way to tell that story, right? And I think that what's fascinating about street demonstrations and protests and activism is that it lends itself to real-time reporting, but that real-time reporting has to include with it that type of journalistic rigor, and I think that's finally where we're getting, right? And so there are times where I've tried to, and I very willingly am kind of a guinea pig. I will try anything. I will play with the new tools, thinking about what is the best tool for this story. So in North Charleston, right after Walter Scott was killed, there's this new thing called Periscope that had come out, this idea that you could live stream on Twitter and on social media, and that wasn't a thing. When you think about Ferguson, which was only 2 years ago, this live video essentially did not exist. You had to download a live stream app and maybe get some extra equipment, and now we can all Facebook Live and Periscope. None of that existed really. So Periscope came out right before Walter Scott, and I remember thinking, all right, how might I use this when I land? What might I do? And so I thought, this video has gone viral. Everyone has seen this 30 seconds, him running away, him getting shot in the back. I'm driving up to the scene for the first time, and I say, how about I live stream this? How about I'm arriving here seeking information. I want the geographic context. Is this a backyard? Is this a alleyway? Where are we? What's going on? And I remember stepping through that, and essentially my pitch was, look, everyone's been talking about this thing. Everyone's seen these 30 seconds. Let's physically look at where this was and what happened so you can better understand it. I think very often what we fail to do on this is provide literal geographic physical context. Is Ferguson a two-block town? Is Ferguson a two-block ghetto, or is it a sprawling suburban town? It's a sprawling suburban town with a little fountain outside of City Hall, right? But we've all only seen the burning gas station over and over and over again, right? And so it's how do I pick the right tool to do this? In Charlotte, and then I'll shut up on this, but in Charlotte, most recently, I made the decision that I wasn't going to march around with the protesters indefinitely. Right, because that's very often what the social media coverage becomes, right? And now we've turned left on Front Street again. Here's another picture of a sign. And so what I decided to do is I said, often what's missing when I cover these demonstrations is the people who come to them, their real stories. Who is this person and why are they actually here? Not a one-line quote from them, And so what I did most recently in Charlotte was I would take a photo of a person. The trick on this is to always pick the people with the signs because you have a really easy in. Hey, I just took a picture of your sign. Can I talk to you? So I talked to these people with signs. And then in real time, I would break off from the march and I would transcribe everything they said. Not the quote, but the full 5-minute back and forth. And I would write it up in a block of text and I would screenshot that. And so I would post both photos at the same time. So I wasn't just giving you a picture of Jimmy, the 17-year-old, and a one line. I was giving him the benefit of speaking in full sentences with nuance, with explanation, and listing those in a row so someone could read through this thread. And if you want to know if there are 100 people in the streets right now, if you want to hear from 15 of them, completely in their own words, why they are here and what they want to do, here you go. And I saw a kind of massive social media pickup on that. I think that's what we need to think about is anytime we're telling someone's story, and if we're covering a protest, that's what we're doing. We're telling the stories of these people. We have to think about what's the best medium and method of doing that.
Mm-hmm. I think we're ready for take some questions if people want to come to the microphone.
I'll start us off. Thank you both for the work that you do. I'm simultaneously furious at the media and really scared for you as we look forward to our next president's administration. I have a couple of questions. I made it through the introduction of your book as we were waiting, and I remember how you said something just felt different about Michael Brown's death. And I wonder why you feel like that might have been a tipping point of sorts. And speaking to your point about the limitations of Barack Obama's presidency, I wonder if his presidency allowed the movement to take off in the way that it has, because as every person of color knows, this has been going on for a long, long time. The only difference is now we have cell phone videos and we have social media. But even then, I just wonder if the fact that we had Barack Obama in the White House, that enabled the national conversations to happen and the reckoning that everybody's had to come to terms with, and as you said, form an intelligent, we hope, opinion about. Second question, I'd love to hear about the state of people of color in the media and where you think, what direction you think that is headed. I'm just so grateful that we do have diverse voices in the media to tell these stories. So thanks again.
Thank you. I think that it's hard to know. One thing I get into in the Ferguson chapters of the book is I revisit this report that was done, and they were done frequently in the 90s. They were called the Pierce Report. And there were these two men, former newspaper editors, and they would go into a city, and their stated goal was they wanted to essentially take the temperature of a given city. They would do hundreds of interviews, all of the Chamber of Commerce, all the business owners, all the politicians, all the activists, all the residents, and they would write these kind of massive takeouts of what is the state of Milwaukee right now, the economy, the race, and they did one of these reports in, I want to say, 1997 in St. Louis, and at the time, they wrote, I might mangle this direct quote, but they wrote essentially, they wrote that issues of race were a volcano ready to erupt in the city of St. Louis. This was 1997. And then in fact, they wrote that it was only a matter of time before a younger group of activists and young leaders who weren't so willing to just sit at the table and be handed breadcrumbs. Eventually, they were going to say, screw the system, and they were going to upend this. That in all of the major areas of public policy, race was there. It existed, and there were these major discrepancies. It's hard to know why in any city the genie comes out of the bottle or has, right? Why this shooting and not this other, right? And as a member of the media, you kind of get stuck in this morbid, I get questions from well-meaning editors all the time, right? So is this gonna turn into a riot, or have you seen this one, or what's gonna happen? And that, because there's this question of, how do I know whether or not this is the shooting, or how do any of us know that this community decides it's going to rise up or this one does not? I think increasingly, we have a conversation often in criminal justice spaces about this so-called Ferguson Effect, right? And people put this forward, this theory or this idea that because of viral videos, police officers are pulling back, and that's leading to a rise in crime. And most of the criminologists who I know and respect, I don't quite buy that. I don't either. But what I do think is true is I think that it is unsurprising that cities that have massively failed to address crime and the tragedy of violent crime in their cities, places like Chicago, where 26% of homicides are being cleared currently, it is unsurprising to me that a population of people who are the victims of these homicides, and who at the meanwhile are also being stopped and frisked, are having school resource officers who are dealing in many low-level ways with police officers, but when it really matters, when you want to figure out who killed your mother, the police fail you. It is unsurprising to me that in those places, we are seeing this type of unrest, because you have this built-in distrust, this built-in idea that the police aren't really serving me. And this is true in St. Louis with sky-high murder rates, Baltimore with sky-high murder rates, in both places that are not particularly good at solving these homicides. Chicago, where we've seen massive protests and unrest. People who are being told by the government's lack of prioritization in solving their crimes that essentially their lives don't matter. And then the police kill a child in the street. And then they won't tell you who the officer was. Then they won't release the video. It's unsurprising to me that we've seen the physical unrest in places that look like that. I think to address the second question, I think that it is, I do think that the ascension of a black president set the table for this conversation. I mean, it's a perfect storm, right? We need the cell phone cameras. We need social media and the democratization of news, that people write articles based just off people's tweets, right? That was not something that existed previously. That there'd be dozens of articles written, look at these 5 compelling tweets from this guy in Ferguson, right? That allows a spread of news and of information and of perspectives that otherwise wouldn't have broken through. Most of the young people who became, faces of these protests didn't have access to the media. They could have written a op-ed for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the Baltimore Sun. They probably wouldn't have gotten their call returned, right? But now all of a sudden they hit these platforms to communicate with tens and hundreds of thousands of people. in real time, unfiltered. They could tell their own stories. And I think that was extremely important. What's interesting, and President Obama has said this when he's addressed this issue, is that it is fundamentally about believing black people or not believing black people. The police were killing black people the day before Michael Brown was killed. The vigilantes were killing black people the day before Trayvon Martin was killed, right? If the Department of Justice has concluded that there are disparate policing practices in Cleveland or Baltimore, or if they conclude such in Chicago, those things were true the day before the Department of Justice investigators got there, right? And that's an indictment of, and so why? So why does it take? Why do we have to watch Walter Scott be shot in the back before we believe that this is happening? Why do we have to see Michael Brown's body lay in the street for 4 hours, right? Because fundamentally as a society, we don't believe black people when they tell us about their trauma. And I think that's an indictment of us and the society in which we live, and also of the media, that for so long, it has been the word of the police spokesperson, the word of the police chief, against the unspoken word of the dead black guy, right? That there have been families in the United States of America, black families forever in the United States of America, from slavery to date, where someone in the family just had a run-in with the cops and it went sideways and now someone's in jail overnight, or someone didn't come home, this is just what happens in black America. And unfortunately, the rest of America has quite a track record of just not believing black America when they talk about it. Really briefly on media diversity, which is something that's very important to me and I know to Kevin too. I mean, I think that what has been true throughout the Obama administration and has been true through the Bush administration before that, and it was true in my father's 30 years as a professional journalist, is that our newsrooms don't reflect the country that we cover. And I think that is one of the reasons that so much of our coverage feels so out of touch with the reality of what's happening in our streets. I say this to colleagues sometimes when they talk about, when they have issues getting demonstrators or protesters to talk to them, or family members of people who've been killed, is we have to remind ourselves that we're covering this distrust between communities and the police, but these communities distrust us just as much, if not more, right? And I don't mean that in the kind of reactionary, well, look at the Gallup polls, they hate you too, media, so you must be terrible. I mean that in there are, as a national reporter dropping into your community after something terrible has happened, I might have just as good a luck as your local reporter because I might have been in this place as frequently as your local reporter, meaning he or she might not have ever have been here in Ferguson before. That, again, if all of these issues existed previously, that means we were missing stories. One of those reasons is because we don't have newsrooms that look like these communities. Our problems of the people who are in our newsrooms are not necessarily the problems of the people we're charged with covering. And that manifests in small and big ways. It manifests when the president-elect appoints someone accurately described as a white supremacist to be his chief advisor, and every major newspaper hems and haws what do we call him? Like a controversial appointee, a provocateur. It's like, no, this guy's like probably a racist and an anti-Semite, right? And we are incapable of saying that. I think this also is manifested even in how we've interpreted and how we've wanted to talk about Trump voters. I've read beautiful pieces humanizing people who seem to be pretty terrible. I've never read a 9,000-word narrative about a Louis Farrakhan supporter. I've never read the black separatist, moving profile of why they, and I have to ask the question why. They've been there for a very long time, right? We have such a reluctance to name and talk about issues of prejudice and racism, and that in part is because of who is making the decisions of how we describe things. There's no prominent black journalist or black commentator who I know who has argued that racism did not play a major role in this election. And I don't know anyone of, again, my black colleagues who would argue that there is not some indictment and some culpability of Trump supporters for that. I know many white colleagues who will argue till their face is blue that it's counterproductive to talk about racism here, that we shouldn't do this, that this is mean and not fair to them. And I think that, poor white people. But I think that speaks to, right, when we talk about objectivity, what is objectivity? Because I would argue that it does not exist. We all bring who we are into how we tell stories, into what we believe is a story and is not a story, and in whether we call Steve Bannon controversial or unacceptable, right? That is shaped by who we are in our own experiences. And so unless our newsrooms and the people making these decisions look like and reflect the diversity of our world, there's no way we can accurately cover that world.
I count myself as a supporter, and you know, DeRay is with his puffy vest, you know, is just like a rock star. But I just wanted to ask you, what goes through your mind now when you hear about police being shot, whether they're by crazy white people or by maybe related to this struggle, if you'd be willing to.
Of course. So I hear immediately anytime a police officer is shot, because I have a lot of fans who will Facebook message me about it or call me or text me on my phone, hey, this is your fault, this officer is dead. And I mean, I actually mean that. That's a real thing that happens, right? And so it's a, you know, and I write about this a little in the book. I also, you know, very often reporters who cover policing critically are painted very specific. You must be anti-police. You must hate the cops. Cops have never done anything great. And it's actually funny because when I go home to Cleveland, I go and hang out in the garage of my 4-year college roommate from a Cleveland cop family, and it might as well be the FOP bar, right? It's literally a bunch of cops watching, you know, the Indians, right? And so I think that, but I think that there is an important conversation to be had about the politics of policing. Policing is essential and crucial to the structure of our democracy, right? That in a very, you know, political science 101 way, this John Lockean social contract, right? We give up some of our rights for the better good so everyone can be protected, so we can all be safe. But because of that, because we are forfeiting rights to police officers, it's so vitally important that we turn a critical eye to our police officers, right? I say this sometimes, right? Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, they don't have the right or the power to pull out a gun and shoot you. Every police officer does. That in that way, they are more powerful than the President of the United States of America. And because of that, it requires us to be willing to ask hard questions, not about them personally, although we probably should ask some questions about who are our police officers, what they're doing, but also about how they're being trained, what their mission is, what their role is societally in our nation. What I think is interesting, and this hasn't gotten all the way dived into, we talk a lot about police militarization, but I also think that we have to talk about the advancement and the evolution of police rhetoric. The way we police our nation is fundamentally political. The police chief is a political appointee. He reports not to the people, not to the voters. He appoints to a mayor. He reports to a city council. And and he's funded by local taxpayer dollars, and his department is. And what that means is that throughout the recession, as this town has to figure out, are we getting rid of the kindergarten teacher or the detective? Are we buying new school buses or keeping our public health center open, or are we buying new patrol cars? That police chief now has to advocate politically for why what him and his people are doing are more important. There is a political incentive for it to be the most dangerous time ever to be a police officer. There's a political incentive for crime to be rampant, and we need to crack down on this, and violent criminals are busting through the border, and they're bringing heroin, and we need to, because that's how you advocate for money and for equipment and for regard. And I think that makes it difficult for us to sometimes have an honest conversation about what resources should and should not be there and what priorities should be taken and not. But I think that's a big part of it as well. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy. I mean, obviously, any time a police officer is killed, it's a tragedy. And, you know, I spent 2 weeks ago when the officers in Iowa were killed, spent time talking to their family and their friends and people who knew them. I mean, we know that, right? But I do think we have to avoid falling into a false equivalence. I think that it's when a criminal kills a police officer, everyone in America mourns. All of us do. When a police officer, an agent of the state, kills someone, our reflex, most of us, is to defend the government killing someone. And I think we really need to question what that means about ourselves and us as a society, that we are so nonchalant about the government killing people.
Hey guys, thank you very much for being here tonight. This has been a ton of fun. It's been great.
It's a very
I've learned a lot.
topic, right? You know.
I was curious what your thoughts were on how we kind of break through this effect of the echo chamber. And what I mean by that is, I think immediately after the election, we saw a lot of sort of people in our Facebook groups, on our social media groups, they're all really angry, really fired up. And, we get into the situation where we're kind of screaming into a space helmet where we're only, kind of voicing our grievances with the people that already agree with us. And, you see those statistics where about half of Democrats are very worried about the ideas of Republicans, half Republicans are very worried about the ideas of Democrats. And I worry that we're going to get into this situation where it's, every 4 years, it's just going to be whose team is everyone deciding to hate on. And I'm wondering, how do we solve that? How do we reach across sort of the line here that's dividing us to try to create some form of unity, if there's any hope for that at all?
If I really knew the answer to this, I would not be working at a newspaper. I would, but I think that, but I do think that there's a lot to be said about that, right? About our polarization, and frankly, I think a lot of that political polarization comes from our societal segregation. We not only we like to blame and scapegoat the technology for this, right? That we only now read the media outlets, or we're only Facebook friends with the people who agree with us, or we only follow on Twitter people who agree with us. Well, yeah, but we also only live around the people who agree with us. We also only go to school with the people who kind of agree with us. We also only go to worship with the people. That we as a society, for the entirety of American history, have self-segregated ourselves, both by creating laws to do this, but also via de facto segregation, where when you look at physically where we live, we remove ourselves from any potential political and social conflict. And I think that the other thing that's fascinating about this, I think back to the Wall Street Journal did a piece, this was during Ferguson, this must have been August 2014, where they had, because one of the themes that kicks up anytime we have this conversation is about segregation, housing segregation. But they did this piece where they were writing about a study that looked at what different people believe is a diverse place to live, right? And how most black respondents to this survey said, like 50-50 would be, I would live in a diverse community if about half the people didn't look like me. And most white respondents were like, well, once like 3 in 10 of the people around me are of color, gotta go. And I think that does speak to some of the core of our issue here. And I think that cuts, I default to race because I know I feel more comfortable speaking broadly about that than I do about political ideologies. But I think that, but I think that's likely applicable broadly, that we often recoil at the idea of being challenged by people who believe something different than ourselves, and because of that, it's much easier to block or ignore the person who I disagree with on Facebook than it is, and much less emotionally taxing than it is to every day have this back and forth, and I wouldn't advocate doing that back and forth. But I think that speaks to some of that separation.
This is going to be our last question.
Perfect.
I know it doesn't happen quite as often, but there have been a few instances in which police officers have killed unarmed white people, young people, that sort of thing. And when you look at the situation, for example, with the substance abuse in Indiana, and people all of a sudden getting hit with HIV, and all of a sudden there's a turnaround in the response to HIV and drug abuse. We have to have a much more humane approach. Is there some sort of threshold? I'm not even sure what my question is, but is there some sort of threshold we have to reach with either young white people or any white people or anybody else being killed by police in the same way that black people are being killed by police?
That's a really good, instructive question, and is a good excuse for me to talk about some of the work my colleagues have been working on for the last 2 years, and I've had a privilege of participating in. So after Ferguson, we decided we wanted to figure out how many people were being killed by the police, who these people were, what the circumstances were. It was shocking to us. I remember being in Ferguson and getting calls from very smart editors who were saying, so you just filed this story, and the head of the police union says that this is a one-off, It never happens. Why are we making a big deal about this thing? Most officers never even fire their guns. And the head of the local NAACP said that black men are being gunned down and executed in the streets every single day. Well, one of those things, they both can't be true, right? If one is true, the other cannot be, and vice versa. And so they're saying, like, why don't you call the Secretary of State or this DOJ? Someone has to have the stats on this so we can, not promote one narrative that isn't true or promote one that is. And we were surprised, to the extent that I kept having editors tell me I could not be right to go work harder and find it, that those numbers did not exist at the federal level, right? And that the federal government did not have, and this has been really revelatory, right? Not only on police numbers, but our national murder rate numbers are voluntary reports, right? New York, all the murders in New York City are not factored into last year's murder count. Well, that tells me that perhaps those numbers are wrong, right? But there were no accurate federal numbers about who was being killed by the police every year. And that, as someone who's worked in kind of public right-to-know spaces and has filed a lot of records requests, that was shocking to me. In my ideal world, there would be a file cabinet with a manila envelope for every single time a police officer fired their gun, and it would have all the details in it, and I could walk in with my press pass and say, I want to see this. And so what we started doing is, and we followed a model that had been pioneered by several citizen journalists and several projects had worked on this, where we started compiling in real time a database of every person who was shot and killed by the police in 2015 and now in 2016. And what we wanted to do essentially was to figure out what are the answers to these questions? Who's being killed? How are they being killed? How often are they unarmed? And what are the other things that factor into this? As we did this, some things were surprising, some things were not. It was unsurprising to me, although it was surprising to some of my editors, the vast majority of people shot and killed by the police are white. Now, I understand why that would be surprising to some people. The vast majority of media coverage of police shootings is about minority victims, but the vast majority of people killed by the police are white, in part because the vast majority of people in the United States of America are white. There are tens of millions of more white people than there are black and Hispanic people. Again, our most recent election showed us this and reminded us of this. But there were other factors that came to this, right? Also, the vast majority of people shot and killed by police are armed, which speaks to the intersection of our policing and guns. This is actually an area where the police chiefs and many of your kind of liberal activist groups have a lot of overlap. The police chiefs are the first ones who say, we need to crack down on guns that are being trafficked illegally because we hop out of the car and we have to assume this guy's got a gun, no matter who they are, white or black, right? What we also saw was a massive number of these cases where mental illness and drugs and alcohol played an effect. That in somewhere between a quarter and half of the fatal police shootings, the person was either in the midst of some type of mental health crisis or was under the influence of drugs and alcohol. That speaks to what is the role we have police playing. We have shootings where a schizophrenic son or daughter is having a tantrum, essentially, and the mother has nothing to do but to call 911. And the officers come, and the son is running around in a circle with a broom handle, and they get scared and they shoot him. And that happens more often than we imagine. And so we're seeing a lot of those cases, right? We have this inclination to assume that if you get yourself killed by the police, you must be a bank robber or a murderer, right? We often hear the crime statistics thrown back in a corollary. Well, black people commit more murder, so of course they get killed by the police more often. The reality is most people killed by the police are not murderers. Most people killed by the police have not just committed an assault. They have not just committed a bank robbery. Most of them, many of them, are committing some type of property crime or innocuous crime, a drug crime. It's about a warrant. And so we have to have a much more nuanced conversation about this. Now, one thing we've done in our reporting, which has been different than some of our colleagues, is that because we've been trying to write about these large, big themes, writing about mental illness and police shootings, writing about body cameras, that we take real care to try to choose not the most salacious anecdotes, but the anecdotes that are most representative of what we know about the broad population of people who are killed by the police. I think that until there's more information about that readily available, we own our data and we put it out publicly. A lot of our friends in the media are very reluctant to have to cite us for anything, but until there's a more broad availability of this information, I think we're going to continue to see the vast majority of the coverage will be about a small minority of the cases. And that's not to say that many of these cases don't deserve that coverage. And we're going to see much less, a lack of nuanced coverage about many of these other shootings. And I think that's too bad. I mean, I think we should live in a world where anyone killed by the police, that is thoroughly investigated, not just by the police, but by our media. Because again, I don't think that, as someone who is inclined towards government transparency and government accountability, I just don't think we can have the government killing people in the streets without the Fourth Estate demanding answers and understanding of what happened.
This is a great conversation, and I think your book is important, and I urge people to go get it. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm glad you all could make it here. And
Thank you for coming out.
And I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
So I think Wes is going to sign some books now, right?
Yep.